Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today, exploring local perspectives on wildfire response and recovery, as well as opportunities to improve federal wildfire assistance. I'm Andy Winkler, the director of BPC's Housing and Infrastructure Project, and I lead the work of our Disaster Response Reform Task Force. The task force relaunched this summer with former FEMA Administrator Pete Gaynor and former HUD Deputy Secretary Pamela Pattinaud as co-chairs. And we have a really wonderful group of new members who have joined us. The task force is working to assess opportunities to improve federal disaster assistance for disaster survivors, really recognizing the need to provide assistance more quickly, equitably, and impactfully. Today's webinar gives us a chance to hear directly from leaders involved in wildfire response and recovery efforts around the country, including some of the unique recovery challenges posed by increasingly catastrophic wildfires, like the tragic ones that we saw last month on Maui. And while we planned for this webinar before the fires on Maui, it seemed critically important to hear about the status of response efforts on the island and opportunities to help its families and communities heal and recover. So to start things off today, I want to introduce Troy Hashimoto, a representative in Hawaii's State House. Representative Hashimoto was born and raised on Maui, and before being first appointed and then elected to the legislature, Rep. Hashimoto worked for Maui County Council Chair Mike White on policy and budget issues. He chaired the Maui County Democratic Party and served as a member of the Hawaii State Board of Education, among other roles. In the State House now, he serves as chair of the House Committee on Housing, where he has worked really closely with his Senate counterpart, Stanley Chang, Governor Josh Green, and others to advance landmark reforms to address Hawaii's housing affordability challenges. So I'm sure it's been a busy, emotional, and difficult few weeks. So we are really appreciative of you being with us today. Honored and grateful you can make some time to share your perspective. So thank you.
Thank you, Andy. It's great to be joining you and, talking a little bit about what's going on here on the ground.
Yeah, so I mean, the entire country really watched with incredible sadness as Maui dealt with the wildfires, and to see, the speed with which entire homes, businesses, and in particular, in this case, such rich cultural and historical treasures, as well as all of the lives lost. So I think to start, maybe you could just give us a little status update on the response efforts on the island, how you see things, and are the immediate needs of those who have been affected, food, clean water, a roof over people's heads, now being sufficiently met?
Yeah, so we are about to hit the 1 month mark of since the fire occurred, and I think it was quite tragic. I think a lot of it was a perfect storm of many things going wrong and not anticipating what would happen. And so I think for in some respects, to be prepared for it, I think it takes something like this to have a mind shift. And I think sometimes it's too late to have that mind shift now because the event has occurred. But I think it's a really good lesson for those who are on this call to understand what steps to learn from our experience and to not repeat it. So I think at least on the ground at this point, we are stabilized in terms of at least people now have immediate shelter. So for many weeks, we were housing a lot of folks in our local gyms, local churches. And I think we were able to take those folks and put them all into hotel rooms. So the state, with the Red Cross, did a partnership to make sure that we could move all those people into our hotel rooms, which sit vacant right now because a lot of visitors are not returning because the town is, I think, in recovery mode. And so at least it helps these accommodations to make a little bit of money while they're housing survivors. And so we're paying for those rooms through FEMA reimbursement. I think they're getting fed. They at least have a roof over their head. And I think the next step now is we're trying to make sure that we have a plan moving forward to figure out how these folks can start the rebuilding process. Of course, the EPA just went in and are beginning their process to do the hazardous material removal. And that in itself will probably take a couple of months before anyone can even go onto the burn site to see their home. And I think that's the pressure that we're getting now is a lot of these survivors want to see their home that burnt down or their business that burnt down. But we're trying to make that process go as smooth as possible. I think we recently signed a contract with the Army Corps of Engineers who are going to lead the cleanup efforts. And so I think that at least they will bring their expertise and they're going to take all of the hazardous materials and they're actually going to ship it off of Maui. We're not going to open a landfill for the hazardous material. But I think the good thing is we're finally stabilized. I think in those first couple of days, you probably saw a lot of national media saying people need all kinds of basic needs. But I think finally we're beyond that point, and now we're moving on to that next step.
So I know over the last few weeks, I'm an avid follower of your Instagram and everything else. You've been listening to people all over, friends, family, constituents, politicians who have come to visit, business owners, colleagues, people who have been affected by this wildfire, both directly and indirectly. And I'm just curious what stuck with you the most. And from what you've heard from people, what they've shared with you, what do you think it will take to really help those affected heal and to recover at the same time?
Absolutely. I think everyone has a story. Everyone has someone that knows someone that has a really compelling story. And there were so many different unique circumstances surrounding this event. I think there's a lot of trauma that's involved, a lot of young kids that, had to see some very, very dramatic moments so early in their life. So I think there will be a lot of mental health assistance that we will have to provide to a lot of these survivors. I think just a few of the people that I talked to, I think they just barely made it out. I think all they could do was just run out of their house. Many times they couldn't even get into their car. They were running down the street, trying to just outrun the fire. And of course, there's incredible amount of smoke. I think there was a lot of regret in their mind because they were leaving. They couldn't even pack a backpack or take anything out of their house. And I think at the moment you don't realize how bad the situation is, right? I think hindsight is 2020, and so they're thinking, oh, I should have brought this and that. But I think now that they look back and have the understanding of hindsight, they're like, oh, lucky thing that I was able to get out and was able to at least have our lives and I think at that point in time you don't realize that it's that life or death situation. So I think when you take a look at what they were facing, though, because a lot of people in Lahaina, there is a lot of wildfires that take place. But I think there was a lot of confluence of events. And I think the fire department in the past has been very confident that they could fight these fires, right? So it's not like they were, clamoring for a lot of resources. And so I think now we're going to have to rethink that, because I think it just takes one event like this, because it was coupled with high winds. So you have to remember that the winds were about 70 to 80 miles per hour. And then the fire was traveling that quickly. We couldn't get any of our fire helicopters up. And so at a certain point, I think it was just a rescue mission of just getting as many people out as they could. And so they could not focus on, fighting that fire at a certain point. And so I think that makes it rethink. And you talk to some of these firefighters and just incredible stories of them trying to just at some point saying, okay, get out, just get out, right? And that was their mission at a certain point. So I think we're going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to cope with the trauma that everyone has faced. I think we're going to have to be very understanding that there's going to be a lot of frustration out there. And there's going to be a lot of voices that want to be heard. So I think we're going to have to continue to listen. And we're just going to have to work with the community, because at the end of the day, when I took a look at the data, a lot of it was just homes that burned. Right. So there's just a lot of people that are going to be displaced. Of course, you have the iconic Front Street that burned in terms of commercial space in one shopping mall, but the rest of it, a tremendous amount of displacement. And so I think that is the hardship that we're really going to face, because I think people are going to want to stay on Maui as best as they can. But at the end of the day, it's an affordability issue as well.
No, that's really helpful. And I want to pick up on that because we've talked a lot about housing in Hawaii before. And, disasters tend to expose and to really amplify the issues that have existed in a place before a disaster hits. So, because you are the chairman of the House Committee on Housing, it's an issue that you've been passionate about, that you've worked on, and that you've made a lot of progress, over the last year in the legislature in trying to advance, some reforms and some new investments and new funding to boost the supply of affordable housing, not just in Maui, but all around the state. So maybe we start with housing. And to your point, so many homes have been either destroyed or damaged. I saw one estimate that put it at about 3,000, single family and multifamily homes destroyed or damaged, over $1 billion in costs to replace some of those. I'm curious what you think it will take to rebuild those homes quickly. And to your point, without the kind of displacement or homelessness in a worst case scenario, or exacerbating other housing affordability challenges that existed around the island and making them more acute than they were before.
Yes, I think there's a couple of strategies that we're really looking at this point. The first is we're going to try and speed up whatever was in the pipeline, right? And I think that in any situation, that's what you have to do. We have a couple of low-income housing tax credit projects that are on the cusp of getting built, so we just have to double down on those and get them to fruition. But the challenging part about this situation, and I think anyone facing wildfires knows this, is you're really held to the cleanup period, right? And how fast can the cleanup of the site and the removal of the debris happen? And until that happens, we can't even think about that next phase of rebuilding. I think in the past, when we've had hurricanes, the counties have essentially said, whatever you had, you can rebuild, and you can do a fast track permitting process to do that. But I think that the challenge that's going to happen in this particular situation, because it was a historic town, a lot of things were substandard, right? So if we're going to build back, the challenge for us is we're going to have to build back, number one, to code, and we want to make sure it's up to code for safety reasons. And so I think that's going to be the tremendous challenge that we're going to face, is that we're going to have to build up to code. And so I think because of that, and we want to make sure it's safe, right? And so because of that, I think the timeline is going to be pushed out a little longer. So I think we're looking at various strategies. The other strategy, aside from trying to push out your current pipeline, is we're trying to really identify other sites that may be available to do some quick build housing, where you can live there in a prefab house, nothing that's flimsy, because we want to make sure that we can repurpose them in the future for other uses, and it becomes the core of our affordable housing in the future. But first priority for those of the fire victims. So we're looking at tracts of land that are already entitled, because I think what we've looked for is, if it's not entitled, we've been having a lot of problems, even though the governor has issued before the fire a housing emergency proclamation. We've been trying to utilize that emergency proclamation and just been facing a lot of pushback from the community. And I think it's a mixture of just distrust with this fire situation. I think there was just some distrust with relaxing a lot of regulations. And so I think my strategy has been, well, let's just look at entitled lands, and you don't completely have to use the emergency proc. But I think that the basic concern is you just need to get that supply up. And so I think that is really what we need to get going. I think we're pushing to get that done within the next 6 months, but I think we know the time frame of FEMA reimbursements ends within 18 months. So we have to make substantial progress within the next 18 months. But speed does matter, but you want to make sure that you can get it done. And I think that's going to be very, very important, because I think at some point these hotels that are housing 3,000-4,000 people, they're going to want to reopen, and our economy is very, very dependent on those hotels. So I think the faster we can get them out of the hotels, the faster we can reopen those hotels. But we need to have that plan. So we're working on that plan right now. It's not going to be easy, because I think because the rebuild process is likely about a year away to remove all the waste. So you can't even start building back on your own property within that year. So we're brainstorming right now. I think a lot of it is going to take a lot of community input, because I think it's a very sensitive area, because I think people don't want this that just letting the gates open for larger scale development. I think they really want to control where the development happens, and so that's a little bit of the challenge too, because they want to keep that charm and kind of the size of the community, but still needing that affordable housing.
No, that's really helpful. I'm curious what you think the role of the state legislature versus local and county officials in this housing recovery will be, and just the role of the state legislature generally in trying to support not only Maui as it recovers, but also to your point earlier about how you better prepare for some of these things, invest in more resilient communities moving forward. That isn't to say that Hawaii, hasn't been used to natural disasters. You've had fires, you've had hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes. So we have a sophisticated emergency management system, but what is this changing, to your point about just your general perspective on preparedness?
Yeah, I think in some respects, this is, probably at the largest scale that we faced in terms of lead times. I think when we had hurricanes, at least you could probably the next day start rebuilding, right? It's just wind damage, structural damage, and you can start fixing your house. Because this one will take about a year. I think that's the challenge we're facing. Even the lava zone, that was more rural area. So I think even though a lot of houses burnt down, it was a little larger, it was a little bit of different circumstance, because you can be a little more flexible. Here it's just a community that specifically these are very valuable pieces of property, very big, good locations to the beach. And so I think, part of what we're thinking is we want to make sure that it's kept in the hands of people that currently own it. I think that's one of the things that we've been trying to address, is making sure that there's no predatory purchasing of these properties. So I think a lot of it is the state looking at what are the issues at hand and trying to assist the county in that recovery mode. I think the state will have a lot of leadership, but I think a lot of it is going to be trying to speed things up and help move things along, because I think what we're noticing is that the local municipality just has a hard time from a capacity standpoint of processing all of this and moving it through. So I think the state supporting the county is going to be very, very critical. Of course, we have the larger funding mechanism, especially in the housing realm, especially for some of the larger rebuilds of projects. Just alone from the state-sponsored housing projects, either through low-income housing tax credit or public housing authority, we lost about 750 to 800 units. And so we know as a state, we are going to have to take the leadership in making sure that we rebuild those 800 units and then add additional capacity, because we know, because of the state will be able to ensure that those affordability ranges will be able to stay in there for at least 60-65 years. And so I think that will be our critical role. And of course we have a lot of state permitting aspects that we will need to speed up on our end. I think one of it is assisting through the wastewater. I think we went in talking with folks on the ground. A lot of the infrastructure will need to be just redone. It's the sewers, I think, are compromised. I think the water lines are compromised. So that 5 square miles, everything will have to be put in. And I think, I'm not sure if the county can sustain that type of hit to their finances. And so I think the state will have to step in from that perspective. But I think bottom line is we want timeliness. We need to push. And I think the state likely will then also focus on those interim housing projects, as well as while people have a place to stay while they rebuild. So I think that's going to be our role.
In addition to sort of what the state can do, what the county is doing, what local governments are doing, is there anything, and you've already talked about the number of federal agencies that are on the ground and helping to assist. FEMA reimbursements, obviously critical in a situation like this. The Army Corps, EPA, cleaning up hazardous materials, you name it. Is there anything you want policymakers in Washington to know about the wildfire and what Maui will need on an ongoing basis kind of moving forward?
Yeah, I think there likely needs to be more of a discussion on rural areas and firefighting and deploying resources in rural areas. Because I think when you take a look at our island community, it's hard for us to get reinforcements, right? Because when this wildfire was happening, it's not like we could call another county and they could just come in and bring all of their firefighters and police department to assist us. It's a plane ride away. You'd have to barge everything in, and it takes a while. So I think when we take a look at standards for island and rural communities that may not have access to broader resources, you have to think a little bit differently on, what is your arsenal to respond to these type of disasters at a moment's notice. And you got to remember that the Lahaina fire was only one fire happening that day. There were two other fires happening across the island. And so, half the fire department was not even in Lahaina because they were fighting two other fires. And at the time when the deadly Lahaina fire started, that wasn't their main concern. The other two fires were actually more concerning than this Lahaina fire. And so I think though that's where a lot of the focus was happening. And then of course this started to get out of control, and they had to then move resources. So I think that conversation of what can we offer, especially when you can't fly, that night you couldn't fly helicopters in. I think that broader conversation needs to happen of what is the standard equipment that you're going to provide to these rural communities, and what kind of support can they count on during times of disaster. So I think it's going to be a very important conversation that will happen.
No, that's a great point. And I know you have focused quite a bit on rural issues, which you have your family has a farm, and I think people tend to sort of overlook Hawaii's rural communities when they're thinking about the places that need to recover from something like this. Is there anything else, sort of for those of us here on the mainland who want to help, who care, who maybe have visited before and fell in love with it like so many people do? What can we do? Are there any organizations to donate to? Is there anything else people can do to help?
Yeah, it's going to be a long recovery ahead, but I think there has been just an outpouring and tremendous amount of support for our community, and it's truly appreciated. I think it takes a lot to make the rebuild happen, and I think that the private contributions will help tremendously. The government's going to eventually get stretched thin. Just this infrastructure rebuild makes me a little bit nervous, but I think in time it will happen, and I think we will slowly rebuild, and we'll work through all the challenges. In the meantime, I think the Hawaii Community Foundation has set up a Maui Strong Fund, and I think that they've raised a good amount, but I think it's going to take more than that. I think one of the things that where we're going to probably lean on the community foundation for is to probably do some of the interim housing. And so I think if people are willing to donate to Hawaii Community Foundation, I think know that that's something that we're thinking about and working on, and they're going to play a very, very important role. Even before the fires, Hawaii Community Foundation was focused on housing on Maui, and so they've been a very important partner in our housing space. So again, that's the Maui Strong Fund through the Hawaii Community Foundation. But thank you for bringing a light to this issue and supporting my community.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Representative Hashimoto, and please keep us updated on the island's recovery efforts. And like I said, anything that people can do to help. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Owen Minot. He's our project's associate director, who will lead the rest of today's program. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you, Representative Hashimoto. We are all wishing the best for residents in Maui. Now we're going to have a discussion with local leaders in wildfire recovery from around the country to talk a bit about their experiences in wildfire response, the challenges they've seen communities face in rebuilding after a fire, and what federal policymakers should know about wildfires. But first, I just want to remind everyone watching on YouTube to submit questions at any time, and we'll try to make some time for them at the end. So first, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Gray Thompson, CEO of After the Fire. Founded after the megafire of 2017 in California's North Bay, After the Fire is a nonprofit organization that advocates, educates, collaborates, and coaches local leaders in wildfire recovery. Jennifer is also a member of BPC's Disaster Response Reform Task Force, which is a group of emergency management experts that advises our disaster recovery policy initiatives. I also want to introduce Tatiana Hernandez. Tatiana is the CEO of the Community Foundation in Boulder County. With a background in nonprofit leadership, Tatiana became an active leader in local wildfire recovery efforts, including fundraising and community engagement, as Boulder County suffered from multiple wildfires in recent years, and notably the Marshall Fire of late 2021. And Rose Whitehair is a senior policy consultant for Tetra Tech, which is a consulting and engineering firm. And actually, Rose was just on the ground in Maui with her work for Tetra Tech. And prior to this role, Rose was a disaster recovery manager and director for New Mexico's Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And she also previously served as the director of the Navajo Nation Department of Emergency Management. And so with that, I'll start to dive into some of our questions. So I'd just like to start by going around to each of you and hearing about your background and experience in wildfire recovery. So Jennifer, why don't we start with you? Can you tell us about how you became involved in wildfire recovery, advocacy, and the mission of After the Fire?
Sure. So in 2017, we had a devastating mega fire. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. We lost 8,900 structures across 4 counties and 43 people died. It was a really terrible experience. And because nobody had been through it on that same level, over the next year, when we were learning, how to recover, all of the processes were brand new. When the Camp Fire happened, in 13 months to the day later, then we started helping in the Camp Fire and then the Woolsey Fire. In 2020, we saw the worst wildfire season on record, and then we changed from a local regional organization into a national organization. Since then, we've spent a lot of time across California, Oregon, and recently in Colorado, really just coaching and then helping. We believe in locally led and designed recoveries, but we also know that navigation is really hard. So that's been our primary mission, which is how do we make this whole process easier by having a network of survivors who are all helping each other to really get through this so no one is alone.
Great. And why don't we turn it to Tatiana? Tatiana, through your role leading the Community Foundation in Boulder, you became involved in efforts to respond to and recover from the Marshall Fire in 2021, like I mentioned. Can you just tell our audience a bit about how that fire impacted Boulder County and what the recovery effort has looked like?
Yes, thank you, Owen, and I'm really pleased to be on this call. It was a little difficult, frankly, to hear Representative Hashimoto talk about what happened on Maui because the similarities between that and Boulder County are pretty incredible. So on December 30th, 2021, a mega fire broke out in Boulder County. I sometimes refer to it as a fire hurricane because similarly, there were 80+ mile-an-hour winds in our community that ultimately burned over 1,000 homes, innumerable number of homes that were affected by smoke and ash, as well as a number of homes, mobile homes that were wind damaged by the event. We lost 2 friends and neighbors and thousands of pets, but the recovery has been pretty incredible. I mean, when we think about Boulder County and similar to what Representative Hashimoto said, disaster response happens first and foremost at the local level, and our community really sprung into action. This is not the first time our community has experienced a major natural disaster. So our county was well prepared for something of this nature. But local governments, everyone was incredibly collaborative, understood that there were data that needed to be shared, action that needed to happen, and a real sense of urgency in our community, knowing that time matters. I can go into more detail maybe in some of the other questions, but on the high note, we're just under 2 years from the time the fire struck our community. So it's still very fresh in our minds. The national average for recovery after a natural disaster is 25% of homes are rebuilt after 5 years. And just under 24 months, we are looking at 58% of homes are in the rebuild process and over 11% of homeowners are back in their homes. And we're pretty proud of that.
And Rose, before your current role at Tetra Tech, like I mentioned, you were a disaster recovery manager for the state of New Mexico, and before that, the director of the Navajo Nation's Department of Emergency Management. Can you talk a little bit about how wildfires have impacted the American Southwest in recent years, and in particular, how they've affected Native American communities?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Rose Whitehair, Rose Deshijene, and I really would like to take this time to say thank you for allowing me to share our perspectives. As the emergency manager for the Navajo Nation, we did have a couple of wildfires that did impact our communities at great levels. And also with the state of New Mexico, there were a number of wildfires that we've already had to live through as well. I think the thing is I am echoing with the other people on this panel and also with Representative, is that across nations, there is intricacies and relationships that we must build with all of the communities, with indigenous communities, including tribal communities. And what I've seen out in the territories as well is that there are mistrusts and hesitancies in several communities that do not want to register or do not go to a lot of the designated federal centers, yet the community centers where their locals already know where to go, who to talk to, those are the places that really should be worked with. And that's what I'm seeing in communities across every generation, every community, every border, every state line, every tribal county line, tribal line. I've seen that across the board with every community.
Great. And Rose, sticking with you for a second, you recently returned from Maui, where you were assisting with the emergency response, as I understand. So what's your early assessment of the emergency response? Do you have some sense of what the challenges will be for Maui's recovery effort moving forward?
Yes, and again, it's the same thing that has been echoed again, time and time again here on this panel. It's basically looking at all of the differences in the cultures, looking at building the relationship and cultivating the relationships that need to happen, because when you're going into a disaster, you have the incident command structure, the incident command system, which is a very patriarchal system. It's a command and control model where all of the unified command and all the leadership and the decisions happens at the top. So as it breaks down further and further and further, according to the rules of 7, where you only have 7 people that report to you, and it just, as I mentioned, you have thousands of boots on the ground and all of these different communities that don't have a voice or a seat at the EOC table. So what happens is those communities get left out of all of the key decisions that are happening. And so, again, I see that time and time again with all disasters. And so working with that, working through that, and just basically understanding and allowing for the cultural differences is a huge part. And I always had to remind FEMA in my own disasters that there's not just one way to get the objectives done. There's cultural ways, there's other perspectives that we need to make sure that we incorporate into those organizations and into those structures as well.
That's a great point. So Jennifer, after the fire, like you mentioned, has been on the ground working closely with local leaders of several different wildfire response and recovery efforts. Based on what you've learned about wildfire recovery and seeing different recovery efforts across the country, do you have any advice for individuals trying to make their way in leading the response and recovery effort in Maui, and if maybe it's their first wildfire?
Well, it's not their first wildfire, but it is their first mega fire. And we really have to distinguish between those. And you heard it with the Representative Hashimoto talking about they had wildfires. They did not expect a mega fire, which is really that perfect confluence of many events. All mega fires are also wind events. And so it's to really start there. We always believe that the community should be central. And I know that that sounds like, what everybody is saying, but really, how do you do that? And it is by putting cultural leaders and community leaders at the table and centralizing them in the design of recovery. We have a different approach. We know that a lot of disaster recovery is very patriarchal. It's exactly what Rose said, and it's top down, and here's what we're willing to do for you. In our experience, communities do best when they use their community as the best research and development on the planet, which is ask, what do you need and how can we help? Like, what did they love about their community before, and then what can they improve upon? The first thing in trauma after a mega fire is people want to get exactly back what they had before, and they want to do it really fast. And that can, be a sad, grieving process, because the day before the fire is gone. And all you have now is, what is it going to be like in the future? So while you are designing your locally led, and, recovery is always local, lean into all of these other communities that have had to learn all of the ways of recovering from a mega fire in particular. There is the mental health component. There's also the designing for climate resilient housing. Maui has very particular gifts and challenges. Gifts, really strong cultural cohesion. Challenges, incredibly high land values, which of course have led to some predatory behavior from unscrupulous people, but they can also deploy a lot of those private donations into putting people back on their land in climate resilient housing that can leap ahead and have housing stock for the next 100 years. But it's going to take everyone at the table, and there is no way that they can get this done unless you have a complete community leaning into getting that done. And don't reinvent it. Lean on like nonprofits like ours, like After the Fire, for community foundations. Call people like Tatiana. Cultural issues, we're so fortunate to have Rose here at the table. Like, see what we can do so that just to make it easier, lean in.
Thanks for that. So Tatiana, turning back to you, the Marshall Fire, as you talked about, was extremely destructive, with a lot of damage, specifically to homes, over 1,000 homes and billions of dollars in damage. So talking about rebuilding homes, over the past couple of years, what have been some of the greatest challenges to rebuilding houses and communities in Boulder?
Well, Ellen, I appreciate the question. I'm going to start with what has worked, because I want to build on what Jennifer just said. One of the things that made our process a lot easier was the fact that we are a collaborative community. The hierarchical nature of, I would say, the federal disaster response model stops short when you get to the local level, when you have councils and town boards and county commissioners and nonprofit leaders that all really work together, even when we don't agree all the time. We do play very nice with each other, which I think is something that we have here in Boulder County that I really am grateful for. So first and foremost, one of the greatest challenges in disaster recovery is always data. It's always information. Who, in the first 2 to 3 months, feel like you're brokering in information. FEMA will often collect information, but not share that more broadly with local leaders. And so we're kind of looking for, how do we get a good census of people? How do we even begin to create the database of how to contact people to do the kind of community engaged work that Rose and Jennifer are talking about. So we were really fortunate in Boulder County. And just for some context for scale, the Community Foundation Boulder County raised $43 million to date, and most of that came in the first 90 days after the event. So we quickly deployed $7 million in direct financial assistance in partnership with our county the second they started the Disaster Assistance Center. We were on the ground handing out checks, asking people, are you an owner? Are you a renter? Do you have language access needs? Do you have additional needs? What are the ages of the people that live in your home? Working with our school district to get a sense of the number of students who might be displaced. All of that data is really, really critical, and it's sometimes forgotten in the process of just the doing. So we wanted to make sure we had robust information. That made all the difference, because from there we could say, here are the number of homeowners, here are the number of renters. We know renters have different needs from homeowners. Okay, division of insurance. at the state level. Deploy, find out from the insurance companies, what are we looking at in terms of underinsurance? Because we know in events like this, underinsurance is always the biggest barrier to rebuilding. The underinsurance numbers came in, regardless of what estimate you were looking at, whether it was the lower end estimate of a cost per square foot or the higher end estimate, they were all in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And so we said, great, we have 43 million. What can we do? We committed $20 million to incentivize people to begin the rebuild process. $20 million at a baseline of $20,000 per household, with additional incentives if you're lower moderate income, if there are dependents in the home, et cetera, the risk factors that make it sometimes more difficult for people to engage in a rebuild process. Thankfully, that helped you. Again, it's about incentivizing, speeding up the process. We were able to parallel that with support from United policyholders. They were one of the first grants we made outdoor, so that people had access to a resource that could help inform them of how to read their insurance policy, how to file a claim, how to work with their insurance agent to get the highest amount of support for the loss that they had on their property. I mean, all of these supports. And then simultaneously, we gave over $500,000 for mental health right out the gate. So making sure that there's a collective and holistic approach that is really based on individual needs, and to what Jennifer said earlier, simplifying the process as much as possible with a sense of urgency and collaborative effort, I think has made all the difference in our community. But in terms of challenge to rebuilding homes and communities, it's always underinsurance, and we know this.
Sticking on the topic of rebuilding, Rose, we talked about some of the needs of Native American and tribal communities when it comes to the emergency response. Are there any specific challenges for these communities when it comes to rebuilding after a major wildfire or other type of disaster?
Yes, actually, just staying on the topic of insurance, there is hesitancy from insurance companies to insure homes on tribal lands because of the fact that most of them are on federal trust land. And so having to try and maneuver through the legalities of that, and then also if there was any type of legal issues that needed to happen due to somebody taking somebody else to court, that type of, which court would be hearing the case, that type of small, normally something people do not think about, but those are some of the things that can keep rebuilding from happening. And then also just the fact that for any community, there is the burden of rebuilding, and the burden of recovery is on the shoulders of that community. Usually by the time all the response and all the FEMA demobes and the recovery, the response mode is demobilized, and then you have recovery. But even after recovery, there's the actual rebuilding, and that is what happens to take the longest and also is the costliest, I believe, in what I've seen in my time responding and helping other communities recover from disaster. It's just supporting the communities with financial assistance and helping with rebuilding is a huge, huge step that I think all of us need to take.
So opening up the question for everyone now, here at BPC, we're really focused on influencing federal policy, and a theme we hear a lot about when it comes to federal disaster recovery assistance is that it's either too slow or too administratively burdensome or just really complicated to access. So I'm curious, are those themes, do those reflect your experience? And if so, do you have any priorities for how the federal government can support more efficient wildfire recovery efforts?
So I'd love to take this one first. Sorry, Rose, if that's okay. So since the moment we had our mega fire, we knew that we were going to advocate at the federal level for our recovery. And we've been doing that since 3 months after our fires, 2018. We regularly go to DC with fire survivors, small business people, nonprofit leaders, to really talk about how the system is not set up for mega fires. It's really set up for wind and rain primarily. I will say FEMA, HUD, SBA, EDA, everyone has learned a lot in the past 6 years. And so we appreciate that so much, but it's an incredibly frustrating process, both in the public assistance and individual assistance, IA. A lot of, we need to push the message out that appeal for individual assistance, because they're often so traumatized that when they get their first denial, they think that that's true, as opposed to that's just the opening negotiation, really. You know, one of the things we're doing right now, which will likely affect Lahaina, is we're working on HR 4970 that is from Lamalfa. Representative Lamalfa represents the Camp Fire area in Butte County, and when the Dixie Fire happened, he also represented that area. It's since been redistricted to Kevin Kiley. This was initially introduced by Representative Mike Thompson, and what this is that any of the claimant wildfires that have, say, a utility was found at fault, including this will affect the Marshall Fire in Colorado, where Tatiana is, the Santiam Canyon Fire. Any settlement that people get from those utility companies is fully taxable as personal income tax, and you cannot even deduct the attorney's fees. We've been working on this for 2 years. It's bipartisan, it's bicameral. Everybody likes it, except it's a tax, you have to change the tax code. I'm going back to DC on Monday to meet with several lawmakers to really say we have to do this today, because we have a huge financial cliff waiting for literally tens of thousands of people who are underinsured or in rural areas or multi-generational houses, which we're very concerned about in Lahaina. No insurance at all. So there's an injustice to this that's just basic. And it's one of those things where we really need Washington to work for the people to make sure that we are getting across this incredibly important need. The only other thing I'll say is we'd really like to see a TurboTax model using AI as a point of equity for low capacity counties and cities to apply for funds that they are entitled to, but they don't have the actual capacity to manage or apply for. I live in a wealthy county, Sonoma County, 500,000 people. We were essentially rebuilt in 5 years, largely because of the privilege that we enjoy being such a wealthy county with high capacity. So it's a huge concern of ours.
If you don't mind, I'll jump in, Rose. Is that okay? Because I appreciate, Jennifer's focus on policy. I'll get into practice. So very much, systems change is a bit of both policy and practice. And what we find is that in practice, yes, federal support is slow, it's administratively burdensome. And again, if the reality is that both response and recovery happen at the local level, if your local governments are not willing to take on the burden of a federal process, they won't, and people lose. And those decisions get made not at the at the county level, at the whatever regional government we're talking about. So we are, again, like Jennifer, are a fortunate community where we have a disaster recovery manager, full-time staff of disaster recovery here in Boulder County that had the capacity to say, okay, we are going to take on something like PPDR. However, when communities continue to face disasters like ours has, multiple disasters time after time, and the entire federal process is a reimbursement process, that means our county is taking financial hits. So what did we do? We said, we will incentivize you, county, to take on PPDR to the tune of $2 million. Meaning if there's up to $2 million of non-reimbursable FEMA expenses in PPDR, you will not eat that money. We will take it on for you. Just please do PPDR. That allowed our community to have debris cleanup completed by mid-August after our fire. So in about 7 months, we were completely cleaned up. We could begin the rebuild process sooner. We were very, very grateful to our county for that. That did not happen one county north of us in 2020, Grand County. Their county did not take on PPDR. Their community foundation ended up spending millions of dollars cutting trees down and didn't even get to the point where they could help people rebuild their homes. So I would say there's policy and then there's practice. The timeline for when CDBG and CDBGDR funds are even available to communities to rebuild does not match the insurance timelines that people have for additional living support. So by the time CDBG and CDBGDR hits communities and are meant to support low-income families in their rebuilding process, those low-income families are running out of their insurance supports to even make the decisions to rebuild. So while they are, we absolutely need federal support to help communities rebuild. the current models are not useful for the people that they are intended to support. I would encourage the federal government and frankly regional partners to lean on philanthropic support. What we've tried to do is to be the early financer for much of the work. Whether or not we get paid back, that's fine. But again, just thinking about creative solutions that can help move money faster, because urgency is the name of the game in terms of recovery.
Rose, I want to make sure you get a chance to chime in.
Sure. So as the ladies had spoken on policy and also with recovery efforts, I can also talk about operations. During the disaster, when you are running an EOC, the suggestion that we've used in the states of New Mexico, I've also used it in Arizona to be able to bring tribal voices to the table, but also with the Navajo Nation. So as I mentioned, the incident command system structure is pretty set in its way. But one of the ways that we incorporated regional and matriarchal voices into the ICS structure was being able to open up a time that allowed within the EOC, within the incident action plan, a time to be able to hear from those communities. So even though we had multiple communities, Navajo Nation had 110 chapters, we have and state in Mexico, we had all of the different tribal communities and the counties. What we did is we did allow for them to be able to voice their concerns at a time that that the disaster was going on. So what we did is I allowed them each, breaking them up into regions, I allowed them each ability to be able to come forward with 3 different points that we brought up during the disaster, is so that people wouldn't go on and on and on and on during the disaster. They broke it up to what I call CAN, C-A-N. What are your current capabilities? What are your current circumstances? What is your ability to be able to respond to those circumstances? And what are your needs? And with those 3 things, all of our communities were able to input into what it was that they were faced with. And that really, really helped us a lot. And as I mentioned, with bringing in the matriarchal voices, listening to those communities, what they're dealing with, that helped us in so many ways to make sure that we were able to work directly with the communities themselves.
Great. And I want to make sure we get a chance to talk about resilience. So we've seen wildfires become increasingly catastrophic, and it's clear that building resilience to future fires is essential, not just to protect lives, but to reduce the scale of future damages. So I'm wondering, in your experience, what are some of the major barriers to implementing wildfire resilience in communities? And is there a way the federal government can support, greater implementation of wildfire hazard mitigation?
Well, I think that we can say with full confidence that the federal government has made the biggest investment they've ever done, especially through FEMA, in any kind of resilience. The issue is accessing it and then implementing it. And that does come down again to privilege and equity. And it comes down to, do you have a county that even got enough donations to be able to supplement? Lots of cool things happening in Marshall. I totally recommend looking at some of the leadership of Tatiana and the Community Foundation. But a lot of community foundations don't get anywhere close to that kind of donations in order to help people rebuild back more resiliently. FEMA and HUD and the USDA, they are making major investments in resiliency, and we've had incredible legislation over the past 2.5 years, Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, there's a lot of avenues to do it, but imagine, you've just had a mega fire, you're a county that did not expect this to happen, and now you're supposed to navigate all of these grant programs from the federal government. Really, what the federal government could do is literally have a grant navigator department that says, here's everything. It's that TurboTax model again, to make it as easy as possible, to make sure that the language is correct so that FEMA or any other agency doesn't have to come and claw it back. We can't, all the technology is here and still being developed for how to build back more resilient communities and how to prevent communities that haven't burned down yet from actually, being completely destroyed by a mega climate event. We have it, but it's very unequal in who has access to it and who is able to actually implement that for people on the ground. And so that's the number one thing I think the federal government is trying to get to now, but we just have a gap.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jennifer. I think, and I will name, absolutely, we were very fortunate and are a very well-resourced community and have been able to do things that I know many other communities couldn't. I grew up in South Florida, and there's quite a bit I can share about post-hurricane response in a lower income, not as well-resourced community. I would add to what Jennifer shared. I mean, what we're talking about is changing behaviors with respect to wildfire mitigation. We're asking people to imagine the unimaginable. Representative Hashimoto started this call today by saying, we never thought this would happen here. We never thought 6,000 acres would burn in the middle of winter in Boulder County. But the reality of that has now changed people's perspective of what is possible in our community. So I would encourage, I mean, if there's ways for insurance to make wildfire mitigation, rebates or incentives for lower costs, that would be wonderful. Encourage people. There are some small things that people can do on their homes that actually make a really big difference, whether that's 5-foot perimeter around their home, vents on all exterior things. There's gutter guards. I mean, there's so many really small investments that people can make. State of Colorado has an incentive program, as a tax incentive program for people to wildfire mitigate their homes, which I think is great. And there's tiny little things that can be done, but the most critical element of this is getting people to believe that what they thought was once impossible is now our reality. And that, I think, is a challenge for us at the local level. I'm not, how we can think about that from a federal campaign. I'm happy to speak with people after this call to think through some ideas there.
Great. So we're running a little low in time, but the last thing I want to ask about is related to equity and community engagement. So we know low income and historically underinvested communities are more vulnerable to wildfire events and have fewer resources to bounce back after a disaster strikes, like we've talked about. And it's important to engage affected communities and leverage their input and knowledge, as you guys have mentioned, but at the same time, it's also important to move quickly and make decisions for an efficient recovery. So I'm wondering if anyone can speak at all about including the voices of local communities in disaster recovery and how you balance that goal of timeliness. How should government officials and organizations leading wildfire prevention and mitigation and resilience efforts, how should they consider those of the people who are most vulnerable to the negative outcomes?
I can answer that. And I can answer it quickly.
Yeah.
If you are at the table and you are being asked to help build whatever it is that needs to be rebuilt or respond or policy, whatever it is, and you are not native, or even if you are or you aren't, raise your hand and ask, where are the locals? Raise your hand and ask, where are the tribes? Do they have a voice in this? And that across the board will help us in so many ways.
Great.
I totally agree. So I just have to say, community is your superpower. Emergent leaders, people with high social capital and who have high levels of trust and integrity, those are your people, and they can communicate with people that they, for lack of a better term, influence. So find your community leaders, your emergent leaders, centralize them. They are not a burden on your time. They are really going to speed up the process.
Great. Well, so unfortunately, that is all the time we have. I'm sure we could talk about this for a lot more time. So I want to thank you so much to our panelists for taking the time to join us today. And thank you to everyone in the audience. I also want to mention that we've been really happy to see the Bipartisan Wildfire Caucus, led by Representatives John Curtis and Joe Neguse, work to elevate the threat of wildfires in a bipartisan manner. We know that wildfires are becoming increasingly catastrophic, and it's really important that the federal government empowers local communities so that they're better prepared to respond to and prepare for these disasters. So I really appreciate the insights from our panelists, and stay tuned for more from BPC because this is an issue we're going to continue to focus on. So thank you everyone so much again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.